Radio 786 100.4 FM. This is Evening Insight, and I'm your host, Mikael Warden. Moving on to the final segment of the night, and that is, of course, politics of the people. We have a very interesting talk tonight. It's Earth Day. Now, I know Earth Day is ending soon. It's nighttime. It's actually Earth Night. But today was Earth Day. And the conversation around sustainability often focuses on energy, waste, and also climate policy. One of the most powerful tools we have to restore the planet lies right beneath our feet: agriculture. Farming is not just about producing food, it's about how we care for the soil, protect biodiversity, and build systems that can sustain both people and the environment for generations to come. In a country like South Africa, where food security, land use, and economic opportunity are deeply interconnected, the way we farm has never mattered more. Now, this evening we are joined by Ryan New, the Managing Director of the Original Grain Company, to unpack how modern and regenerative farming practices can play a vital role in restoring natural resources, strengthening food systems, and creating a more sustainable future for South Africa and the continent at large. Ryan, good evening and welcome to the airways of Radio 786.
Mikael, thanks for having me. That was a very comprehensive introduction.
Thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. Now, we talk about sustainability globally. Agriculture doesn't always get the spotlight. So why should it actually be the center of this particular conversation on a night like this after we've had the day of Earth Day?
Let me first just quickly touch on Earth Day and the focus on sustainability.
Please.
I think what we need to realize is that it's not an automatic process. It's actually shaped through change in policy, change in technology, and change in practice. And sustainability and looking at those changes has been the overview for many people around celebrating Earth Day today. If we go into your question, agriculture really should be at the center of global sustainability conversations, because it quietly sits at the intersection of several of the biggest challenges which we currently face in humanity. And those are, it's deeply tied to climate change. Agriculture is one of the largest users of land and fresh water globally. It's fundamental when it comes to food security and human survival. And agriculture also has huge untapped potential for positive impacts. So if we look at it in short, sustainability is about balancing environmental health, human well-being, and economic stability. Agriculture is where all three sort of collide most directly. Mm-hmm. And if you're ignoring it and trying to fix a system while overlooking one of its central pillars, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, fantastic. So we've obviously in the introduction mentioned, farming, and from your perspective, how has that role of farming evolved from, simply just producing food to now being a key player in the restoration of the environment?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because many people don't realize how it has not only evolved, but it's had to evolve. Farming used to mainly be about one thing, and that was produce as much food as you possibly can. For most of history, how efficiently land and water and labor could be used to feed a growing population. Yeah. But over time, with industrial agriculture, this focus led to many unintended consequences, like degrading soil and water pollution and biodiversity loss and increased greenhouse gas emissions. So today the role of farmers is about expanding beyond food production. It's into what we would say of more of an environmental stewardship, which is driven by both a necessity and new scientific understanding. So if I can say, farming has evolved from a purely extractive system into a potential regenerative force. And you're going to hear that word used a lot this evening, regenerative. Because the modern farm isn't just feeding people. They are doing a lot more. They're managing the landscape. They're having to stabilize the climate systems, and they're looking to rebuild ecosystems.
Yeah, definitely. We normally touch on topics like this on a Monday, with our eco-wise segment, right? And we've actually had conversations, and I always love how anything to do with being, wise about the environment, whether it is global warming, whether it is climate change, whether it is agriculture, whether it is renewable energy, the change from fossil fuels to renewable energy, all these things all link to one thing, and that's human impact, right? And I think we tend to forget that. We tend to forget that this planet was made for us, for sustenance, but we were also placed with the responsibility of caring for the planet. Now, a lot of people, they associate farming with, land degradation. A lot of people will say, it's the farming that caused us to have global warming. It's the farming, the over-farming, the GMO seeds and all these things. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories around farming being the bad guy, when farming was actually the thing that we know it's human nature. To farm is a natural human thing. We know this by our nature, right? So how do modern practices challenge the perception and actually work to heal the land in the world of farming today?
So that perception which you referred to, that comes from a long history of what we refer to as extractive agriculture. Things which define extractive agriculture are heavy tilling, monocropping, overgrazing, and a big one is chemical overuse. And you mentioned in the beginning of the segment soil. Again, that'll be mentioned a lot. That extractive agriculture had a big impact on degrading soil as well as water systems. But there's a growing set of modern approaches is flipping that model by working with ecological systems rather than working against them. And at the core of that idea is this whole regenerative agriculture, which aims not just to sustain land, but actively have farmers work to improving it. And some of the basic tools that are put in place to assist that is looking at things like covered crop to prevent erosion and retain moisture, reduced tilling farming, which is a big one. It'll also come up often. Increased use of things like compost and manures, and then a very important one is rotational grazing. So those are areas which are used within this word regenerative agriculture, and it's very important towards us maintaining a level of sustainability.
Wow. That's actually a very beautiful way to answer that question. A lot of people, unfortunately, we live in a world where the ignorance to everything that you just mentioned now, Ryan, is so amassed. It's like we have mass ignorance today, and we don't tend to look at what's right in front of us. We've fallen into this consumer trap that we have to just, continue taking to a point where we are almost out of things. I've spoken about this multiple times.
If you look at it, Mikhail, we from our company, our involvement is at all levels. And I think until you've actually viewed the process at source, until you've been alongside the farmers, you've worked with them, you've seen what's required, you've seen the challenges they face and the changes that they need to make, until you've actually been through that, you'll find a lot of people, the consumers, are very ignorant or naive to exactly what is required in the farming process.
You know what actually opened my mind to understanding how the world really works when it comes to the world of agriculture? I watched a series about farming. I watched Clarkson's Farm. And I was like, when I watched the first season, Jeremy Clarkson is a car guy, car journalist. As a child growing up as a young man, met him, had the opportunity to work with him. It was an amazing experience. To see a man who's good at drifting cars and racing cars buy a farm and try to make this farm survive. And he just messes it up in the first season. And
I don't think he knew what he was getting himself into.
No, 100%. And this is and he said this openly. He explained in season 2. He realized, he said, you know what? We have to give more knowledge and take away this ignorance of farming, because it's more than just planting this and planting that. It's the weather. It's the type of soil. Your soil is the most important thing. It's the most important thing. Yeah. And when we talk about soil, and I mean, we've seen this all over the news in the UK at one point. It was very big. Within that series too, is that farmers were being forced to go ahead and use things that were not good for their soil, yielding a very big yield this season. But their soil for next season, for the next farming season, would be completely destroyed and not be beyond repair. Some of them lost their farms. And so when we talk about the soil itself, this is the crux of the question. Soil health is the foundation for stability and sustainability. Why is that soil health so important? And what happens when we get right to right into that moment when we look at our soil, right versus when we get it wrong?
Yeah, so I think it's always mentioned as the foundation for sustainability. And in our last 10 minutes of us speaking now, soil has come up over and over again.
Yeah.
Why is it so important, and what happens when we get it right versus when we get it wrong is the best way to look at it. And soil health matters because soil isn't it's not just a dirt, it's a living system, and that living system underpins food production. So when it's functioning well, it quietly supports almost every terrestrial ecosystem and much of human life. But there are times, as you've mentioned, when they get it wrong. And I think if you listing some of the things when you get it wrong, the challenges when we get it right, we get productive agriculture, we would get water resilience, we'd get climate regulation, we'll have biodiversity support, and we'll have reduced erosion. Those are all essentials for farmers in sustainability. When we get it wrong and we degrade the soil, we face with things like loss of fertility, big erosion, water problems, climate impacts, and then biodiversity lost. So the simple change in focusing on the soil, not just being a simple dirt, can have a massive impact on the farmer's sustainability.
Yeah, 100%. And I completely understand that. Now, we've spoken about the world of farming. I want to bring it home to South Africa, right? What are some of the biggest challenges that the farmers here in South Africa face, when trying to transition, into the more regenerative side of farming? So
I think if you look at the biggest sort of barrier to entry for our local farmers, it's definitely got to be around funding. The high cost and upfront cost and the financial risk makes it very challenging for them to invest in a lot of these things that can bring about the sustainability. Shifting, to a more sustainable farming, it sounds straightforward in theory, but in practice, it's a combination. It looks at a web of economics, environmental, and structural challenges. Some of the more sort of natural challenges they face is the water scarcity and our climate variability. We're facing the last 2 seasons, particularly in the Free State, where we've had some very erratic rainfall.
Yes.
And that's made it very difficult to manage yields around white maize, which is where we have a lot of our businesses involved. Other problems that they will face is a thing of a lack of knowledge and skills. There's a big gap for sustainable farmers to have the correct mindset and the technical know-how. And then another big one is market access. So if you reach the opportunity whereby they can now have larger farms, greater yields, you now have to sell that crop. And many of the farmers are given the opportunity to maybe scale up, but they haven't been given the opportunity of how to now access different markets to move from a basic cash crop to a more commercial farmer who needs to take that product to market, negotiate with buyers, meet with your co-ops, discuss terms, delivery, bags, those sort of things. Those are some of the challenges that the farmers locally face.
Wow. That seems... it's a very...
Seems daunting.
Yeah, if someone that's interested in farm, like now, that's like, I don't think I'll ever... And I don't think Jeremy was ready for that either. And that's what I'm saying. I don't think anyone is ready for that. And so this turns me to a position of, this is why we should appreciate and applaud the people in the farming industry, because their job and their livelihood and their ability to make sure we have a livelihood outside of that is determined by things that they can't control. They cannot control the weather. They cannot control the soil. For the most part, they can't influence what happens to the soil after you have a yield. Maybe there's a pest. Somehow a pest might get involved. And there's so many things. And so they have to do all these things not knowing So I remember a quote from that series. One of the farmers said, it's literally sow and hope for the best. That's what he said. He said, sow and hope for the best.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's
there's a lot of faith that goes into farming.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the biggest thing. That we have to understand that this is an opportunity for the earth to regenerate, to give us back, And what you put in is what you get out is the same that people talk about in the secular sense. But if you look at it from a perspective of faith, what you plant, if you have faith that it's going to grow and it's good for you and it will be sustenance to you, it will definitely grow. That's the belief of anyone who has any sort of faith. So I want to talk a little bit about climate resilience, rather. We speak about climate, we spoke about it now, we opened it up, that can of worms on its own. But climate resilience is a major concern globally. How does agriculture help communities better withstand extreme weather patterns? Like you mentioned right now in Gauteng, there was that extreme rain. Here in Cape Town, we've also had a lot of flooding over the last couple of days now. But there's times when there's droughts, there's times when there's flooding, there's times we had the water shortages here also. So how do we talk about that in that light?
So when you refer to support systems, I think there's various support systems, whether they come from government, private sector, or NGOs, which are needed to unlock and protect farmers against these sort of situations which we face. And just unlocking, underutilized agricultural land responsibly isn't just about giving the people the access to that land. It requires a coordinated support to reduce the risk and helps them to build the sort of capability. So a secure, workable land tenure system is one of the most important things which can assist them, and that is government-led.
Wow.
You can get infrastructure investment, which comes both from the public and the private sector. I've mentioned it before, you can have access to finance and risk-sharing tool, which can also be provided by government. And then you've got technical extension services, which are provided by government and NGOs. And these are the sort of things which can be offered, as I said, by both government and NGOs, which can assist these farmers in being able to better plan and prepare for any eventualities, whether it be around weather or whatever they face on farm.
Awesome. Now, how can investment in agriculture become, not just economically viable, but also environmentally responsible at the same time?
So I think agriculture becomes both viable and responsible when environmental performance is treated as a source of productivity and not necessarily a constraint on it. And I think that's very important to remember. So, in other words, if I said soil health, water efficiency, two things we've mentioned a lot, and biodiversity, which also comes up, are not extras. They are actually the core assets, if I can call them that, to determine long-term profitability. So making agriculture both profitable and environmentally responsible is essentially about redesigning or restructuring incentives and practices so that what is good for the land also improves long-term returns. And I think that point touches on what you raised a few minutes ago when they were pushing for high yield. That's going to give you something good for that immediate season, but it's not going to be able to focus on the long-term returns which you need.
Wow. Now, there's often a gap between policy and implementation. Where do you see the biggest disconnects in South Africa's agricultural landscape at this point in time?
So, in South Africa, our agricultural sector, the policy framework is often quite sophisticated on paper. That's the best way to describe it. It's focused on the land reform, inclusive growth, food security. But the biggest disconnect which we found tends to be emerge in that what we call the last mile. The institution's capacity and the systems needed to actually deliver those goals consistently. So one of the persistent gaps which we see, particularly in the land reform versus productive use of land, is the issuing of land and funding to communities or individuals who have been waiting for some time, who have been able to access it through the land redistribution process. But that's where it ends. They don't get access to working capital. They don't get mentorship. there's no infrastructure, and there's no reliable, extensive services. And as a result, that land, that which has been redistributed to them, is underutilized and usually falls out of production. So the intention is for the redistributive justice. The implementation challenge is building sustainable farming. So it's not about necessarily the provision of the land. Mm-hmm. It's what they do after that land, which will assist the farmer in getting to the point of being able to fund the equipment that he needs, fund the seeds he needs. Seeds are a massive cost for us in South African farming. And that's where we see it falling short often in South Africa, that the land that they've given usually ends up very underutilized and a small portion of it being farmed.
Wow. Interesting. Now, how important is education and knowledge sharing in helping farmers shift towards more sustainable approaches?
Okay, that in a nutshell, that's crucial. Sustainability in agriculture, it's not just about farmers swapping inputs. For example, moving from a synthetic fertilizer to a compost. It honestly requires a deeper change in how farmers understand soil health, water use, pests, and climate variability, as well as long-term productivity. So that kind of shift depends heavily on the learning and ongoing support. Without that learning and ongoing support, we're not going to be able to see that change, which, as I said, is crucial.
Now, that's so important. I think education is always, knowledge is power is the saying, right? And it's always important for us to have these conversations. I mean, this segment is exactly for that. Not just to educate farmers, but to educate the community and to bring, the expertise of people like yourself and the company, as well as the people you work with, to speak to our listeners about this at a surface level, to give them an understanding of what's really happening in the world of agriculture. We've spoken about so much today. But one of the biggest things that always comes up, and a listener also asked a question relating to this particular next moment that I'm going to ask you now, is food security is a very big deal. It's a very big deal. What role does sustainable agriculture play in ensuring long-term stability rather than the short-term resupply?
Okay, it's important to realize that when we refer to food security, we refer to being able to get a consistent supply. That's what's important to remember. And sustainable agriculture plays a central role in that food security because it focuses on maintaining food production over the long term, again, as we've mentioned, over the long term, rather than maximizing output only in the short term. You touched on that, and I think that's very important. Yeah. In the short term, food security is often producing enough food, like right now, through high yield farming, as we call it, intensive fertilizer use, irrigation expansion, or the rapid scaling of production. But sustainable agriculture shifts that focus to keywords, which for me are continuity and resilience. And it aims to ensure that farming systems remain productive as of now, but also for future generations. And we do that by protecting the natural resources on which they depend.
Wow. Now, how can localized farming efforts strengthen communities and reduce reliance on external or imported food systems?
Okay, so when you say localized farming, what we refer to here is growing food closer to where it is consumed. That's localized farming. And it can strengthen communities and drastically reduce dependence on important food systems in several interconnected ways. And if we look at those briefly, firstly, it improves the food security and resilience, number one. Secondly, it keeps money circulating locally instead of spending on imported food. Third point is it strengthens social cohesion and skills transfer. If you look at examples like community gardens and cooperatives, which is a big thing we see. Fourth, it reduces the environmental costs, which we associate with long supply chains. And finally, which is important, it builds community and bargaining power. But, having listed and said all those things, local farming isn't a complete replacement for broader food systems. Regions still need to trade for foods that cannot be grown efficiently everywhere. And in this situation, the strongest model is usually a hybrid system, where we have both local production covers a baseline of fresh, perishable foods, while the external systems supplement the diversity and the scale.
Awesome. Now, what we've seen lately is that technology is rapidly changing many industries. How is innovation shaping the future of farming in a sustainable way?
So, I mean, that's a good question, and one that comes up quite often. And innovation is reshaping farming in ways that aim to produce more food, but with fewer environmental costs. I think that's the best way to look at it. The overall direction is towards more smarter systems, where we look at data and automation and biology work together to reduce waste and conserve resources. One of the biggest shifts is what we call towards precision agriculture. And precision agriculture looks at, instead of treating entire fields uniformly, farmers now use GPS monitors, sensors, and satellite imagery to apply the essential things like water and fertilizer and pesticides only where they need it. And in my experience, that precision agriculture there's been a big shift in farmers towards utilizing that, because those input costs around fertilizer and pesticides are incredibly expensive. And the scarcity of water means that by using the GPS, they're able to find where the soil needs it most. The other one, which is starting to creep in with a lot of farmers, is also the use of drones. Drones are used for remote sensing and also monitoring farms as well as crop spraying. So those are things that we've seen creep into innovation.
Awesome. That's so good to hear. It's always nice to hear that technology is changing the way we do things for the better. And I'm all for it.
I think, Miguel, the important thing about innovation is it's the key way for us to keep up with the erratic change in weather. Innovation is essential. That's our sort of the only way we're going to balance out the challenges we face around the weather, is to look at ways to innovate.
100%. Now, looking at the African continent more broadly, what opportunities exist for agriculture to drive both environmental and economic growth?
Okay, so if we look at the continent as a whole, Africa sits at a particularly interesting intersection, because it is still the largest employer in many countries, yet it is also underperforming relative to its ecological potential. So we have, large agriculture sectors has large employment, but it's not performing as well as it could. And it's that gap is exactly where those biggest opportunities lie, because the improvements in productivity can simultaneously raise incomes. It can reduce environmental pressures, and by doing that, it indirectly strengthens food security, which is vital for the African continent. So one of the clearest opportunities in Africa is to look at climate smart and regenerative agriculture. There's that word, use it again. Mm-hmm. And we outlined what regenerative agriculture was in the beginning. Another major growth areas is to look at better use of water and irrigation expansion, but doing it more efficiently. And I would say the third opportunity lies in a value chain development and agro-processing. So overall, the key opportunity is not simply more agriculture, but it's a transition towards higher value, lower impact, and more resilient systems. That's what we need on the continent.
Awesome. Now, are there any success stories or case studies that's either happening locally or globally that shows what's possible when sustainable agriculture is done right?
So I think one which does get mentioned a few times, and it pertains specifically to the Western Cape and the Cederberg region, is a well-known brand around rooibos. And the rooibos farmers have adopted a completely regenerative approach to their farming. Okay. And this includes restoring degraded soils, working with indigenous plant systems, and a big one is reducing their chemical dependence. And what that has seen happen is that they're now in a position where they've produced stronger ecosystems, which are able to recover well in a fragile and semi-arid land, which is where they're located. It's improved long-term viability of a very climate-sensitive crop, which it is, and the preservation of indigenous agriculture knowledge systems is what they've been able to obtain. So as a brand and from a farming perspective, they've really introduced the regenerative approach to their farming techniques.
Wow. Now, the interesting thing is that I remember mentioning this one of our other segments, but Kenya seems to be doing very well in the space of renewables. In regard to agriculture, is there any changes there that you've heard of or that you know about?
So look, if I look at Kenya and East Africa as a whole, in our largest commodity in South Africa and one that we deal with directly is around is white maize.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, it's not necessarily a change that many will see as positive, but it is a necessary change. East Africa was focused when it came to white maize on only non-GMO. It would not allow genetically modified maize to be grown in Kenya.
Yeah.
And fortunately or unfortunately, there are various perceptions. The need for food has now outweighed the need for the perception around genetically modified or non-GMO. And Kenya, as of last season, started introducing genetically modified seeds, which could then be planted into white maize. So, although, as I say, there is a perception around GMO and non-GMO, I think it was a very interesting change in a region that was very firm on focusing on having non-GMO crop. But they've gone through some difficult climate change, and their white maize stocks are incredibly low. And then they needed to take a stance whereby the introduction of genetically modified seeds was introduced into their agriculture.
Interesting. I love to hear things like that. That was a curveball I threw now. But
Zimbabwe have been the same. Zimbabwe have the same. A couple of seasons ago, Zimbabwe wouldn't allow any genetically modified maize into the country, but their borders are now open to GMO maize because they've also had the same problem. They've struggled with weather and drought and having successful crops.
Wow, that's fantastic to hear. Now, if we as a country, but also as a planet, continue on our current path without adopting more sustainable practices, what risks are we facing in terms of food system and environmental health going forward?
Yeah, I mean that's a good one to cover because if the current global food production continues on its present trajectory, then there's a high dependence on fossil fuels, intensive monocultures, and again heavy chemical inputs, and continued land and water conversion. And the risks to both the food systems and the environmental health become increasingly interconnected and reinforcing. So we really need to see some change. And one of the most immediate pressures that we face, and again, it's that word we're facing, is the degrading of soil. That is probably one of the largest pressures that we face. And if we don't see a change towards regenerative agriculture, planting, the soil there's going to be big impacts on our soil quality.
Wow. And Ryan, we'll close with this because we are unfortunately out of time. Finally, on a day like Earth Day, what message would you like to leave with for Africans about the role of each of us and how we can play, what role we can play rather, in supporting a more sustainable agricultural future?
I think, Mikhail, the message for me is simple, and I'd like to leave is that sustainability in agriculture isn't something distant or reserved for the policymakers or the large firms. It's something each of us influences every single day, and we make that influence through the choices we make and the systems we support. So if you think you don't, as a consumer, can have any impact or can impact on agriculture, you're wrong. Our influences every day through choices we make, we'll be able to see that change.
Awesome, Ryan. Thank you so much for your time and for the fantastic, enlightening segment. Wishing you a fantastic evening further and a safe week up ahead. Enjoy the long weekend. All the best and take care. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thanks again. Cheers.
Cheers. That right there, the voice of Ryan New, who is, of course, a very, 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 very important person in the world of Agriculture Managing Director of the Original Grain Company, talking to us here on Radio 786, wrapping up Earth Day with a conversation about the future of farming. And what an interesting show we've had tonight. We've heard about, the project happening in Rafirsona End with the masjid, so come and be a part of that. We heard about a young gentleman who has started a business and making clothes in the community. We've heard so many things. We've also heard from what's taking place in Lavender Hill. There is an expo taking place there over the weekend. So there's so much things that's happening in our community, but also in our country, but in the world. And we covered so much of it tonight from different lenses and different aspects. So I think with that, we'll say shukran so much to everyone for tuning in, and shukran for allowing us to keep you company this evening. And we'll be back tomorrow, inshallah, just after 6 p.m. We'll start off the show. It is Thursday tomorrow, so you know what Thursday evening looks like. We've got, the show, the consumer wellness, where we chat to Dion Sherman. And then we sometimes have, I think this week we have it again, we've got the Iran update. And then we also have the update with Professor Yusuf Chikta that normally happens on a Thursday, and then we have the Dhikr. So it's going to be a jam-packed Thursday evening, inshallah, and we look forward to sharing that time with you. But hey, Sitara Half is not here tonight. Unfortunately, Lifestyle Matters is not on tonight, but we have a lecture coming up after this. So myself and the team, we are heading home. So wishing you, from myself, Mikhail Wooden, and the Evening Insight team, Brother Shabir Jacobs, bidding you Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Radio 786. Hear the difference.
Do you have difficulty calculating your zakah? Are you unsure if you are allowed to give zakah to family members? Do you know the conditions when zakah